You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Timothy Phillips. Timothy Phillips is a Deputy Director and Acting Director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, commonly known as AARO. He assumed his duties of the Deputy Director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office in October 2023. He is a Senior National Intelligence Service Executive appointed in 2006, with over 40 years of government experience, serving in a variety of senior intelligence community assignments in the field and at agency headquarters. He is a retired United States Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel. His educational achievements include a Master's in Business and Information Resources Management from Webster University, Master of Military Science from the Marine Corps University, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from the University of Arizona.
Tim Phillips, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me today.
Now, Tim, as an acting director of AARO and AARO personnel, in your tenure with AARO, did you see anything that gave you pause? Because that's what everybody's going to ask. They're like, did this guy see anything? He was on the inside. Did he see anything that they could not identify that looked really, really weird that might lend validity to the question of UFO UAPs being of technological origin?
Okay, well, I did see some amazing technology that was being developed by our country and our allies that could be misidentified as something from another world. I did see that, and based off a lot of the interviews I set in on, where you had people lawfully present during the testing of the new system, but we're not read into that program. We happened to see something fly by or something on a tel that was about to be launched. You can understand how they could, based off their worldview and their education, could probably misidentify as something coming from another world or the reverse engineering of an alien technology. Some of the videos and the debriefs from the people who were firsthand witnesses are UAP cases. There were events, there were objects identified that we could not identify, working hard to do so. And it was, for me, it was a little bit alarming because we tend to put sensors at things we want to protect, national security sites and critical infrastructure. And if we detected something in the maritime domain or in the atmosphere that we don't understand from a national security perspective, I consider that very threatening. It's a national security risk that we should not take and we can't afford to take. If you look at the development of UAS technologies, these drones are becoming more lethal and more autonomous. But I personally did not see anything that alarmed me. There were things I did not understand at the time, but I saw nothing that I would have thought was either supernatural or had performance characteristics beyond what we would expect of a fielded system or even a new capability that was being tested and developed.
Now, in specific, and the reason I asked that question was the infamous Malmstrom Air Force Base incident where the UAP supposedly shut down a nuclear site, nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear arsenal, and that made it out into the culture. Now, AARO looked into that, and it actually happened, but partly appears to have been some kind of misidentification. What's the story on that?
We actually looked into that case, and hopefully in the next version of the historical report, there's going to be some more reporting on that, where AARO and its researchers went into the Air Force archives, and we were actually able to get some of the engineering tests, some of the investigative work the Air Force did to try to understand what happened. And there's been new stories about an EMP test that I was not privy to when I was still in the government. What I knew about was a report of a cascading transformer failure where there was electrical storm, and these silos were actually connected to the commercial power grid. However, they did have their own generators and critical power, and they would switch off to their own generators so power would not be interrupted. There was some electrical disturbance that actually defeated those filters, and the silos themselves were taken offline by a cascading transformer failure. Wasn't supposed to happen. Very, very concerned that a part of our nuclear retaliatory capability was taken offline. So we were aware of it. Air Force did a lot of engineering studies trying to duplicate and understand what happens and then re-engineer their power system so it could not occur again. And that's the research and the story that AARO was working when I was there. There were also some reports of security personnel up above who, in some of the stories, that they saw UFOs or things they did not understand. We were able to get logs at the various towers, and we did not see any evidence of UAP or UFO activity in the journals and logs that AARO actually got to investigate. So that's what I'm aware of, and I'm sure when AARO gets through the coordination and staffing process, they'll be able to share more of that in their formal report to Congress, which will be a releasable unclassified version they'll share with the American public.
That in itself is scary during the height of the Cold War, though, where if you have any kind of power outage, deprivation of power to your nuclear weapons when you need, because you can knock out a power grid with a nuke, just air burst it and send out an EMP. And if your generators aren't working, you are at the mercy of your adversary, which that's very scary for that period in and of itself. So that piqued my interest because it turned out the reality was scarier than perhaps the UFO phenomenon.
Well, unfortunately, we found that we had a vulnerability we didn't know existed. We thought the engineering that had been done and the equipment installed would have prevented that type of cascading transformer failure, and it didn't happen. So a lot of hard work was done. Air Force actually cooperated with some of the national labs to duplicate and understand what the failure was and re-engineered their systems so it could not happen again.
Now, in regards to another famous case, there is new information, and that is the 2004 USS Nimitz case. And my understanding is that nobody really still knows what exactly that was. It was just strange, and the pilots seem to be saying exactly what they saw, and there's some footage of it out there from gun cameras. But one aspect of that was the appearance of, I don't know, basically men in black, people showing up from somewhere else in the government, confiscating data and then leaving. What was that?
Well, hopefully, when the next addendum to the historical reports is made public, we actually found out that DARPA, their scientists, technicians were actually aboard the Nimitz battle group when they were doing that workup for their deployment with Third Fleet. So they had a handheld ISR system that was being used in support of the exercise, which they actually deployed in combat. That system was still sensitive, was being protected as a classified system. We actually had our chief technology officer in the office was at a cocktail party in Old Town Alexandria and ran into the former director of DARPA, retired at the time, and we were talking about the Nimitz and how frustrating it was trying to solve something that occurred over 20 years ago, and we didn't have access to the records to truly understand the event. And our officer happened to find out that DARPA was there, and it was actually some DARPA technicians dressed in black that had flew out to the Princeton. There was a retired chief on the Princeton that was in a television show, and he actually discussed one evening a helicopter landed on their flight deck and a bunch of civilians in black dropped out. And what was so unusual about that is these civilians went into the captain's stateroom. That is unusual behavior on a warship. But while they're underway, went into the stateroom, and then when they emerged and got back on the helicopter, they were carrying a lot of equipment and kit with them. What we now know today is they were recovering components of their ISR system that was being used during that workup, during that test. And not everybody was privy to the existence of that ISR system being deployed during the exercise. Now, this is a small handheld system doing optical collection. We actually wondered if that system could have been detected by the F-18s at altitude with the radars and the software build they had in those aircraft. Our scientists don't think that was possible. We don't think that the F-18s would have picked up this system flying at the wave tops. However, the Spy-1B radar on the Princeton may have. It may have picked that up. We're not sure. But we know during that exercise, there was enough strange activity ongoing that Third Fleet, who was actually in his staff embarked, realized there was something unusual going on and directed that the data, the surveillance data, be preserved, and actually had people go over to the Nimitz and over to the Princeton and get tapes of what happened. We know that data was flown back to Third Fleet headquarters in San Diego, and it was subsequently flown to Dahlgren, Virginia, where they did the exploitation. Working with the Navy and the OPNAV staff, there were 2 physical searches completed at the request of AARO to try to find this original data. We could not find the data. And to compound our frustration, the flight logs, the journal, all those historical documents that should have been archived that would allow us to cross-check and validate times, places, aircraft numbers, who landed where, we could not find. Very, very frustrated. I know the OPNAV staff did a good job of trying to go back with the information they had, doing new interviews, trying to understand what happened over, almost a week of operations out there. There was some strange activity. We don't know what it is, but because of that failure, AARO exists, and now within the Department of Defense, there is instructions to report UAP activity, and just as important, to retain data so we can investigate, analyze, and understand what happened. That's what happened back in 2004 is a mystery. We do believe the aviators that saw something. We can't tell you what it is. Even a lot of the videos we had today was not the original video with the metadata that our scientists would want to get a hold of to analyze. There are some of the stories that go fast, or certain aspects of part of that UAP case, incidents that were highly publicized for those cases be analyzed by AARO along with the Navy to try to understand, and reaching out to the crews, some of the crews, to understand what they saw. We're never going to solve it, unfortunately. It was too long in the past. We don't have the original source data. But the good thing about it is, due to the reporting of people who actually got it to the attention of both the American people and Congress, AARO was enacted into law, and now you have an office that has a trained staff, has the legal authorities and operational authorities it needs, and it has the expertise to kind of analyze what's going on. And within the Department of Defense, there is a draft instruction. Right now, there's a message that went out from the J3 mandating that they do reporting and retention of records, but there is a DDI, a DoD directive that will mandate it in the future. I had reported that up through my chain of command, and I know that the DepSec was kind of amazed that when she asked how long would it take AARO and the Joint Staff to actually have an instruction issued to the Department of Defense, to DoD, and I had mentioned it was about 3 years. And it's probably going to take that long, maybe a little bit longer with new administration and new staff there. But it takes a long time through the bureaucratic staff there, to put out new instructions to the force.
Is it possible within government, and I ask this as a broad question, you having worked in many areas of government, is it unusual that that data was missing? In other words, I mean, it seems to me that the data from the Princeton would be valuable because something spoofed the radar. And it seems to me you'd want to know what that is. At least according to what's out there publicly, and that it was, showing returns of something, and we don't know what that something was. And then the pilots went out and saw the something, so there was something there. But it seems to me that would be data you would want to preserve, because that's the phased array radar of an Aegis cruiser. So is it unusual that was missing? I mean, have you looked into other cases and found holes like that? And is it possible that someone scrubbed that data?
It was a comedy of errors. I don't know if there was a nefarious actor that did their best to destroy the evidence. We don't know. There was a good faith effort to try to find the original records to understand those events. I don't think we're ever going to know. It was so long ago. We have the observations of the aviators. We know that aircraft were actually vectored. They picked up anomalies on their radar. We know that, they had track data. There was something there. They actually, sent F-18s to go take a look. At one time, we understand from interviews, they actually shut down the training and the evaluation because, they were concerned about some of the operational tracks that were showing up on the radar systems that they went off and investigated. Don't know what it was. There were probably other players out there, and we did not know that DARPA was part of this until last year is when we found out. Because there may have been other technology or other capabilities being tested. There was some observation about some bubbling, some things under the water. And we know that there are technologies where, things actually go from one domain into the other. Not sure what happened, and I don't believe we're ever going to know. So if there was somebody who was intentionally trying to hide, data and the facts about what occurred out there, they did a good job because we couldn't find the original, source data.
Yeah, and it's always possible it'll show up in a warehouse.
Good.
At one point with NASA, there was entire reels of footage of the Apollo missions that had thought to be lost until they found them in a warehouse, and they had been forgotten, and they were able to restore them. Same with the nuclear test footage from all of the tests during the Cold War. That footage only recently came to light and was restored by a project to restore that film. So stuff disappears.
Well, we actually had a few dividends from that effort. I know there was an Atlas missile test that from Vandenberg where there were claims that an alien spaceship interfered and there was a laser that destroyed the rocket as it was being tested from Vandenberg. And we actually found out that there was a test and there was destruction of a rocket and a warhead, but that was part of a test that the Air Force was doing to test the resiliencies of our systems against Soviet countermeasures. And I know that AARO had spent a considerable sum going back into the archives and getting the original 35 and 70 millimeter film, digitizing it. That's going to help explain what we know about a particular Atlas rocket launch failure and some of the folklore about UFO interfering with that launch. And there was some pretty amazing countermeasures and things that occurred. It was command detonated, but it was our engineers that did that. It wasn't, aliens that interfered in a test. And we understand there was quite a few witnesses to that who saw it, and it probably would have been pretty amazing.
But it is also important to mention here that when you find stuff like that, it means the witnesses were right. They saw something that they could not identify, which is an unidentified flying object, and they could not identify it. So, and if the government can't talk about it because it's some secret system that, involves intercepting, a missile, especially that far back, that's going to create some folklore, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I was always amazed at the accurate descriptions of people who came to AARO, either sent to us by Congress or they responded to our secure reporting mechanism and said, hey, I was a DoD contractor and, I was a firsthand witness to the government reverse engineering alien technology. And their descriptions of what they saw, we found to be very accurate. They would come in, they would tell us what they saw and why they thought it was, some type of advanced technology from another world that was being tested, exploited by our engineers. We would thank them for, their insights and their reporting, their interview. We would remind them that non-disclosure agreement was a lifelong obligation and not to talk to anybody else about what they saw after we were done with them and they signed their statement and said we captured their testimony correctly. But then when we did the research, we'd go back to the archives or the test reports, especially with some of the videos or the pictures, amazingly accurate. These were patriots working out there. With trained engineers and military personnel that saw something that they weren't witting to. They weren't read into that program, but they did see some pretty amazing things. And based off their worldview, their training, their education, and how many, science fiction movies they may have seen, they may have made assumptions that weren't accurate. I know that we try to put an image in our SAP-CAP version of the historical report to show senior members of Congress how reasonable people could misidentify something as being from another world because it's so amazing in its appearance. And it actually looked like an alien spaceship. But those technologies, those systems, those spacecrafts were, developed by us, fielded by us and tested by us and then, flown by us. They just were not read into those programs and didn't understand what they were observing. And there were some other concerns, and a lot of them dealt with operational security and compartmentalization. As you know, our government would be quite keen to recover the remains of an advanced, adversary aircraft or missile that went outside the boundaries of their territory, that we would have opportunity to recover. Now, we wouldn't want them to know that we knew where that object was. We wouldn't want them to know that we successfully recovered it. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of compartmentalization. You've got a lot of spooky people out there recovering advanced technologies. But in every case, those technologies were, invented, and produced and operated by human beings, not being from another world.
The prime example being Project Azorian, where the United States concocted a very elaborate, with the help of Howard Hughes, really happened, yes, Howard Hughes built the Glomar Explorer ship, which was recently scrapped, and they went out and recovered at least part, if not all, of a Soviet submarine during the Cold War from the ocean floor, but used misdirection because the Soviets weren't exactly sure where that submarine precisely was. So they were using misdirection and things like that to say, yeah, we're not looking here. We're actually looking for manganese nodules. We're going to mine the seafloor with this giant...
Which was a credible cover story because we actually did that.
And actually, that's really important now. There are people that it's economically viable now to possibly mine the manganese nodules off the ocean floor. But the weird thing is that those nodules are involved with oxygen production on the seafloor, which is really, really ecosystem important down there. And
yes, it could have unintended environmental consequences.
Got to be careful. That's why I say, why don't you go mine the moon for the metals? Let's do that. Now, cases where you found that something in the past that has been rumored in the culture actually did happen. And one of these might be something that in the culture is called SOM 101, a special operations manual for the recovery potentially of UAP. Did you find that document?
We did find a operations plan for contact with alien beings. When I became acting, I got cornered by a staff director, and he wanted me to come back and brief DOD's plans for contact with an alien being or alien material. And said, DOD, it's the one thing you do is plan, and I'm sure that you have some CONOPS or operational order somewhere. Come back, and I want you to, brief us on what the plan is. And it seemed very, very reasonable to me. As you know, I didn't come from the UAP world, so I came back to the staff and informed them of the request, and they started looking with the cooperation of the Joint Staff, trying to say, what do we have in a way of a contingency plan or an operation order on how to deal with that first contact with alien material or an alien being? We were astonished that we couldn't find a current plan. Now, we did find a very, very well-written, period correct, as far as the style, the font, the paper, a plan going back to the 1940s that was designed for the Department of Defense to respond to a UFO incident. However, when we worked with the archivist, we were trying to determine, was this a real plan? And we never could find proof it was. Now, maybe it was and did a wonderful job suppressing it or controlling it, but we never knew. And I don't think we spent a lot of time researching a past plan. And we started working on DOD support to a recovery of space debris or a spacecraft, where you have the Department of Defense supporting probably a governor, a mayor, tribal authority, because the chances of something from space coming down on federal property, it's probable, but it's probably going to land in somebody else's backyard. And the Department of Defense is going to be in a supporting role to help protect, our population from rad hazards or, toxic fuels or live ordnance of something that is deorbited and landed in U.S. territory or territory of one of our friends that asked for our assistance. And we started working with the Northern Command, J5, because they're responsible for the defense of the homeland. And that would be their response to state and local tribal authorities if we had an incident like that. And we do have highly trained teams on alert that is their job, to recover a fallen spacecraft or debris, because based off the power supply on that unit, if it's, a nuclear reactor, that could be bad, or some type of fuel that could be extremely hazard, to living beings. So we have people trained. DOD excels in the logistics, the security, the command and control, rapid access to scientific capability and engineering expertise, where DOD is just probably the right organization to provide support. But we also understand that we may be supporting the effort of a governor or a tribal authority, because that's where the thing landed.
And that's important to remember, is that the only real way that the federal government can go onto private property is with a court order or eminent domain and actually acquire it. And there are cases like the famous Broken Arrow, where we dropped a nuclear bomb on ourselves and it yet didn't explode, but almost did. And the government to this day has to curate that because it's, I think, too deep and too fragmented to actually recover. So there's a U.S. nuclear bomb from the Cold War sitting in South Carolina or North Carolina, wherever it is. But let me ask you this, and this is going to be the point blank question, because everybody that's into the UFO, ufologists that study this, which they certainly find a lot of interesting stuff, and I'll get to asking about that soon. But one thing that they always, will regarding the manual, the document you saw, did it have, and I understand you don't know if it's real or not, but it looks like it was really well made. Did it have the letterhead at the top, magic eyes only?
I don't recall that. What I actually had was a book. It was almost like a regular war plan. It was a bound book with a tan cover. It was classified. It was controlled. Um, in the security controls that were on the book, disclosure, who had access, they were all period correct. Those were the procedures used in place in the mid and late 40s. That was almost, over 2 years ago, and I don't want to make a guess and say yes or no. I don't recall the name of the document. That would probably be a great FOIA question for AARO.
Now, regarding what was in the document, were there diagrams, and can you describe what these diagrams were? In other words, were there diagrams on how to box something up?
No, I did not see that. What I saw was typical DoD language for task organization, command authorities, logistics, signals, and then a lot of concerns. There were a lot of questions on constraints. It was a procedure. It was almost like a cookbook. If this happens, here's your checklist, and this is how you respond. And I actually thought it had some great content. Whoever put it together had some expertise and put a lot of thought into it. And it was really well written. It looked real to me. And I'm not an expert on what operation orders from the 1940s look like, but it looked like a professional document. And I'm a graduate of Command and Staff College, and we actually helped prepare them. And I worked on combatant staffs and contributed to the editing and drafting of war plans. So I'm a little bit familiar on how that work is done and how that's coordinated and staffed. And it looked like a professional piece of kit. The document that I saw.
Now, in regards to that and other documents, there is a proliferation, plethora of documents out there that are called the Majestic 12 documents that seem to hint that there was a government organization called Majestic 12 that managed the early, perhaps, recovery efforts of UFOs, or there's all sorts of lore around it, of course. But did you find any evidence that this group, Majestic 12, which included a lot of luminaries, according to the story, and including Detlef Bronk and Dr. Donald Menzel and all these, luminaries of the period, astronomers and generals, Nathan Twining, things like that, did you find anything that led you to believe that there once was such an organization, and what did that organization do?
No. And that research was done before I actually arrived. Sean and the staff had access to original documents, actually talked to many, if the principals were still alive, people who were aware of the claims in that Majestic 12, document and organization. I don't think that we were able to validate or confirm any of that material. And I know that in a lot of like the Wilson letter and things like that, during the interviews where I was present, the principals who were named and some of those cases went on the record and said that, those claims were incorrect, distorted, or just not true. So that was before me. I wasn't personally involved in that investigation or any of the claims of Majestic 12.
Did you ever run across anything that involved potentially advice given in letter form to the president in the documentation that would have been authored by J. Robert Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein in the 1940s, the late 1940s?
No, no, there were claims of things that were briefed to the president. We couldn't find any historical evidence to support that. And I think we covered that in the historical report.
So no drawings in that document, huh?
No, 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 not at all.
Not at all. Okay.
There were no how to prepare, transport. Did not see that in the DoD document that we found dealing with the procedures, how DoD would organize and respond and react, on the ground to a UAP or UAP contact incident. This was more involved with the logistics, the security, building a communication, some type of secure perimeter. Public affairs would be a huge part of that, communicating with the public and media relations, dealing with the executive branch, going up the chain of command, reporting the findings. But there were some really good checklists on, how to prepare, what to ask, what to look for. I thought it was a good document. And I believe that document is out there in the wild on the internet, different forms of it. But we did do a search, and we did find something, as I mentioned before. We just we never determined if it was real or not.
And that becomes a problem, again, because you're looking back in the past, and everybody that was in government at that time is either out of government or dead.
Correct.
So there's nobody to ask. And is that a constant problem with AARO?
When we go back that case that far, yes. Some of the cases dealing with like what was Lockheed Martin and Scott's Works, what were they doing? In that case, a lot of those engineers and presidents and CEOs are still alive. And in many cases, there were interviews and discussions about their insights and what they worked on. And they worked on a lot of advanced technology. None of them admitted to us that they were, reverse engineering alien technology.
Now, Tim, in a modern context, in other words, when you can't, go back and ask the original participants of a case that happened in 1955 or something like that, you can't really, not much fruit's going to come from that. So in the modern context, AARO is coming up with ways where, number one, we keep the data in case something weird happens and you have a full data set to study in AARO, but also the crucial aspect that AARO also can identify nation state threats. In other words, you saw something, you didn't know what it was, but it turns out that's technology from an adversary. And that is basically half of what AARO's doing. Describe that aspect.
Oh, I'm happy to. So a big part of what AARO does is to prevent technological and operational surprise. So the world is just too dangerous of a place for us to detect something we don't understand. And close proximity to operating forces, critical infrastructure. If you look at conflict as they evolve today, what's been going on between Russia and Ukraine, this war that just occurred between Iran and Israel, you see the rapid development of uncrewed, unmanned systems that are getting more and more, autonomy, more capable, and more lethal. And often, in some cases, you have complete autonomy and you may have a man or in the loop or on the loop, but in the future, you may have machines that are going to decide to do kinetic strike. So we don't protect everything due to the size of our country and the expense, but we do protect things that are important, things that we derive our power, our center of gravity from. Think of anything involved with nuclear weapons. We're probably going to have sensors out there. And that goes back to Sean's, background, where he came from. Sean did a lot, in missile development and defense and space awareness and defense of space. So that was Sean's background. He understood that would be a big part of AARO's work and our contributions to national security. So Sean and I were a little bit disappointed that we weren't finding aliens. And there was a guilt factor with me because we're spending all this money and I've got nothing to report back to Congress that addresses the reason that we were formed. But we did have findings. So we did find cases of advanced tradecraft where an adversary was using tactics to divert the attention of our security personnel as they were conducting a test. We did find evidence of that, and we did report evidence of that. We did find either a training or a configuration issue with some of our new advanced aircraft that were getting targeting solutions on something that wasn't there. One of the things that we were extremely proud of is how we took some UAP reporting by aviators out in Westpac, and we were able to, working with the rest of the community and working through the data, the sensor data collected by U.S. operational systems out there, where we had a report of UAP, but working with the intelligence community, we said, no, that's not a UAP. That's a new adversary ISR system that we haven't seen before. So we had a partial signature, and then using some of our analytical capabilities and that of our agency partners, we were able now to understand that our adversaries had fielded new operational capabilities that were initially detected by UAP reporting by U.S. aircrews, which is a huge operational success, an intel success. And those are the things that we brief Congress on. And now the public's not going to get that information because we don't want to give away what we know about our adversaries' capability. But AARO contributed to that.
Now, Tim, AARO has multiple jobs. It's not just a UFO office, and it was stood up not only for the reason of, and we have to credit Sean Kirkpatrick for this, but not only for the reasons of looking into unidentified objects, aerial phenomena, but also identifying nation state technologies that are being deployed, new technologies, and understanding them. And we live in a world where a freighter pulls up near a U.S. Navy vessel and launches a bunch of drones, something like that, and spies on it and tries to probe its capabilities and all the things that they do. AARO is also tasked with looking into those and finding new nation state national security threats. Tell us about that aspect of the work.
Well, that's an important part of AARO's contribution to our national security. So we have reporting coming in from Department of Homeland Security, FBI, commercial airlines, and of course, the Department of Defense. Often we'll get a partial signature of a new capability that we can't identify. So as you're aware, the Defense Intelligence Agency has a signatures database. So we'll go back into what's known about fielded capabilities, and now we've got something that doesn't match with that. So AARO's going to say, what is that? And AARO just doesn't passively collect. So we get a report. AARO will go back and look at all national data capabilities of and our allies. So we're looking at air traffic controls, we're looking at space surveillance radar, we're looking at weather radar, we're looking at maritime's capability, we're looking at, all of the national capabilities, what we call national technical means, all those spy satellites you see in the movies. AARO has the ability to tap that data. So what we can do, we can get a UAP report, and then we can start layering it with more data that we can collect. In some cases, we may put out our own sensors. I know later on we'll talk about the Gremlin, some of the active systems that we can put out to try to detect things. And we want to get beyond, the reporting and be reactive to UAP. If we understand that there's a UAP threat somewhere, we have things in the maritime environment, the air domain or in space, we don't understand. We want to make sure we have sensors to detect that as soon as possible, build a track, and then provide indications and warning to somebody who cares. So AARO's all part of that. The new National Defense Authorization Act is actually going to make AARO part of the coordination process for everything UAP. So what the public calls drones, because of AARO's expertise and analyzing partial data to kind of understand and identify partial signatures of something detected in the maritime or the air environment or domains, often we're out there looking for UAPs, but we may detect drones. Now, if that drone is operating restricted airspace, we want to know who's operating it and what is it doing. And we need to pass that track at mission speeds to the organization responsible for force protection and security. On the other hand, if we have an agency that's protecting their airspace, they're out there looking for UAPs or cruise missiles, and they find something, okay, in their airspace that they don't understand with a performance characteristics that can't be correlated with something known. We need them to identify as soon as possible and get that data reported to AARO so we can get our military and scientists to the site, to the incident site, as soon as possible to preserve data, to do interviews, and to set up sensing capabilities so we can kind of capture that and understand the phenomena. I'm real pleased that cooperation between the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, NOAA, with DOD is actually very mature. There's a lot of trust. AARO works at the OSD level. It's an OSD organization, but AARO will do direct liaison. You'll have a person in the field will see things to formally report it. They need to go through their chain of command. But we've actually had launch control centers have an anomaly when they're doing a safety sweep prior to launch. They've got something that they picked up with their sensors they don't understand. I've actually called AARO just through the relationship on past visits we've made and say, hey, we've got someone trespassing in our airspace we don't understand. Can you help us? And we've been able to get scientists, military personnel to the site with hyperspectral imaging capability to help them understand. And then we will collect all the data they're willing to share with us, get it to our labs and our mission partners so we can start understanding that phenomena and maybe understand a new capability that our adversaries have fielded. And that's a big part of AARO's mission, is to kind of work across, the departments. We have Title 50, which is intel. We have Title 10 authorities, and then we get to work with state, local, tribal authorities. When they have a case, they can report it to us. And every time, every incident, we've asked for them to declassify or share their data with us. They have. The cooperation within the governments across the United States and with our allies and our partners has been superb. And one of the things I do want to add, people are talking about how AARO doesn't have access to the crown jewels and all the secret, things that are out there. I never witnessed that. I've had a security clearance now for 44 years, and I have never had access to SAP-CAP information, advanced technologies, covert operations as I had in this job. The cooperation, the willingness of the intel agencies and DOD, even law enforcement entities to share with us their sensitive information about UAP cases was absolutely amazing. When I met with our bosses, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, or I work with the Principal Deputy or the Director of National Intelligence, one of the things I would always be asked is, hey, Tim, are you getting the cooperation? Is there anything I can do for you? Is there anything in your way? And I had the same type of cooperation from members of Congress to the 12 oversight committees that we reported to. They were adamant that they wanted to know anybody in the government or even private sector that was trying to block an investigation. And it just didn't happen. There was one agency that was reluctant to share a picture of a covert action, something that they were doing at a superb capability. I was asked, do I need any help? And I had actually asked if they could convince this agency to release an image to AARO so we could put it in the SAP-CAP version of our historical report during the coordination of that document. In that meeting, that agency director was called and was told to give Tim what he needs. I have never seen that type of cooperation and willingness, to open up these these compartments for these sensitive programs we try to protect. And we did. Now, that was also, I'll tell you, a challenge that we did have. Often when there would be an incident, we would have to determine, was that a blue system? So we've detected something, we don't know what it is. One of the questions we have to ask, is it one of ours? We found out that you had to be very, very specific who you talk to, and within that three-letter agency or that Air Force department or DoD department, who you talk to. So I may talk to the S&T community and the test community, and they can say, no, it wasn't them. But if you didn't talk to the ops guys may have, went off and purchased a capability that they were operating that the S&T community did not know about. So we found that to be a little bit of a challenge, and we just took more time doing that staff coordination and asked and pointing questions. But I do want to say for your audience, there was superb cooperation. And I got to say that the political, the confirmed Senate appointees, these cabinet officials that we work for, they wanted to know the truth. They would have been incensed if they knew that there was a government agency trying to hide information from us. They wanted to know the truth. They were very, very concerned that somebody or an organization in the executive branch was running some type of capability operation that was not properly briefed and disclosed to congressional oversight. We could not find evidence of it. Doesn't mean it didn't exist, but we could not find evidence. And we did search. We did historical searches. We did a lot of interviews. When we would go on site and meet with aerospace, manufacturers, or go off to the various IC and DoD labs, they opened things up. Very, very senior chairman of one of our oversight committees actually tasked me to go out to Nevada to the test site to have a complete briefing on some of these advanced sixth generation capabilities that some may have misrepresented or misassessed as being some type of reverse engineered alien technology. And based off that tasking, got read into those programs and received those mission briefs. And even me, I was astonished at what I saw. There was some amazing engineering and U.S. capabilities that our country has developed and invested in that we own and operate. And I'm glad that I was instructed to do that because it provided real insight on why these witnesses made these astonishing claims to us. We found that we believed their observations were accurate. They just didn't understand what they saw. Hope I answered that question for you.
Yes, you did. And let me ask you this. This is just out of a personal curiosity. The Nevada test site, and my father used to work out there. When he was still alive, he was a contractor, worked for Emerson Electric, and
yes,
they would test stuff in that huge site. But the big elephant in the room is Area 51. Did you get to go to that particular area of the test site and take a look around?
Absolutely. I received an aerial tour. I met the wing commander. They gave me a historical overview. There's a lot of historical sites there on the site that they're attempting to preserve, going back to the old CIA days and the development of the U-2 and some of the other aircraft out there. But yes, I think when we were talking earlier before we went live, I had mentioned when I got off the plane and I was being greeted by the commander on the tarmac right there. I looked over and there was this beautiful 1950s era aluminum car-size UFO sitting out there parked. And I kind of turned to him and I said, "What's that?" And the good colonel had, talked about the parade they do. They've got a lot of people are isolated out there in that high desert, and part of their morale, the things that they do, is they have a UFO parade. And that was one of the floats that was superbly engineered and manufactured, sitting out there, where it could be observed by many of the people on the mountaintops trying to get insights to what type of vehicles are being tested out there at the Nevada test site. So, yeah, it's an amazing place. I wish some of the artifacts could be in the Smithsonian, and maybe someday they will.
Probably, probably. But I wonder what, I have to wonder whatever happened to the Soviet defector plane that flew over here and landed during the Cold War. What did we do with that? Did we scrap it?
Oh, the one that went in Japan, the MiG-25?
Yeah, the MiG-25, and that, and then also, anything related to like have blue. We know what blue means. Have blue,
Sure.
which was the F-117, and
Correct.
I would anything that they would have on the development of that aircraft would be amazing to get in the Smithsonian.
Well, and they do. They have a lot of models, the not full size, but reduced scale that they flew and they towed. And one of the things that some in your audience may have been exposed to, they call them alien eggs. And I actually saw them on the test site as I was being, flown around and driven around, is they have these superbly machined big metal, looks like aluminum balls, these big spheres of different sizes, and they litter the ranges. And you're out there looking at them, and they briefed me, and they use those for calibration. When they're out to do a test, they have a superb array of sensors out there. But to calibrate their sensors for the different tests, they actually drop these from altitude, and they know the characteristics. They know the radar cross section and absorbance rate. They understand the engineering there, and it helps them adjust their sensors. And we know that there was a lot of speculation about what these things were. These things were so perfect they couldn't have been, manufactured by, human beings. And I saw out there on the internet there's some ball that somebody claims came from another world, and I saw a guy with a multimeter claiming that it was emitting signals, RF energy, and I'm an old Marine guy, and I probably wouldn't use a multimeter for that. I'd use a spectrum analyzer if I was looking for RF energy. But there's this popular culture about things we don't understand coming from, mysterious sources like aliens. And a lot of this stuff could be explained by, peer-reviewed science.
Well, the sphere in question actually was apparently a ball valve from some industrial process where the ball would close and an artist had bought a bunch of them to use in his artwork, and one fell off his truck and it landed. Well, that led to a conspiracy theory that the Project Blue Book head scientist J. Allen Hynek had actually stole the original one that was behaving weird and replaced it with the ball valve. And there was just this whole conspiracy theory and lore regarding it, which is fun to look at. But at the same time, what are you left with in the end? You're left with the ball valve. You can't verify anything, and everybody's dead that was involved with it.
That reminds me of some of the cases where AARO was asked primarily by Congress, to do material analysis of materials derived from UAPs or an alien spacecraft. I know the Army had spent a lot of money trying to recreate some of the special anti-gravity properties of this material, where you could have a 60-ton main battle tank would levitate and act like a 10-ton vehicle. So AARO received this equipment, or these metal fragments, and we, as you know, we have a relationship with the Department of Energy and their various labs, Sandia, Livermore, Oak Creek, a lot of the old, nuclear weapons, program infrastructure. But they did a double-blind test. I know that we paid for the installation of a new gas mass spectrometer. That is just incredible. But we did legitimate scientists double-blind tests and just asked, what is this material? Come back, and they did a 100-page report. it was sad that the scientists who actually did that analysis for us were so intimidated by the UAP believers, that caucus of folks that were demanding evidence. They did their best efforts as scientists, peer-reviewed science, and said, no, this metal was, common and produced by Americans, in the 1950s and 60s. It's probably the remnants of a missile casing. They were so afraid of being vilified, by UFO enthusiasts that they didn't want to put their name on it for their own personal security. And Sean knows a little bit about that. He had someone show up at his house. For some, the belief in this stuff it's almost a religion. And one of the things that we were always careful to do when we hired staff, and we were able to hire some of the best and brightest out there, is if people were hard over either way, they with scientific, conviction that there could be no, alien life force, that could make it here just due to the issue of distance and time. Or someone who is a true believer and said there was an alien behind, every unexplained incident. That's not what we wanted on the staff. We wanted people that were willing to analyze the evidence, that was available to ask insightful, questions and be able to, run every lead and be open-minded about it. We were neutral on the whole aspect of the supernatural. I'm a Christian, so I believe in supernatural things. I think there could be a dimensionality where the rules of physics, as we know it in the universe that I live in, the dimension I live in, I have to comply with it. I'm subject to that reality. But there could be another dimensionality. It could explain some of this stuff. But the scientific proof, the evidence that we could gather, we found nothing supernatural. We did discover things we can't explain, and we'd like to know more. And we want to be proactive. We don't want to, what we want to do is instrument, provide sensors, try to detect these anomalies as soon as possible so we could direct sensors and get more fidelity, more collection, and then eventually better understanding on what this phenomenon is. We've made huge investments in computing and in storage and providing a network from the sensor, trying to do as much as possible at the edge to discriminate, especially against known signatures that we're aware of, so we can send back the true anomalies back to the scientists so they can understand and create new knowledge or intelligence in the case of some of the adversary ISR systems that we help develop. That's what AARO's in the business to do. If we find aliens,
Nobel Prize.
I'll tell you, we thought about that, and we do have an understanding that it's not going to be the director of AARO that's going to share that with with the public. That decision, how and when, will be up to, first through the chain of command, up through the Secretary of Defense, and with the executive, the President of the United States. That's well above our pay grade, but we haven't found it. There's a lot of scientists that would love to be credited with those types of discoveries and aggressively look. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We weren't afraid of it. And the talent, the people that wanted to come into AARO was absolutely amazing. The current director of AARO had actually applied to be, when I was the acting, I'm not a scientist. I'm an intel officer and a retired Marine. I know my limitations. And for the credibility of the office, we had to find another Sean. We had to have a credentialed scientist to be the director of the organization. And that was the constraint. Everybody understood that, and we were looking for the right person. But John Kolosky, applied to be my science director, and he was superb, and I would love to hire him in that job. But I was only funded at a GS-15 rate. He was a senior, and went back up and asked my seniors, "Hey, I've got an absolutely superb scientist. I think would make a superb director. And I got to say that John, the director now, is just an outstanding director who's got a keen mind, credentials, comes from that mechanics or that quantum, processing mechanics from the NSA world. Absolutely brilliant. Wants to do a lot to get outside of the security bubble we often operate in and have science challenges the way NASA used to do, where we can get some unclassified data of a case we don't understand and present it to the public as a challenge. So we've worked this.
Citizen science.
It's science. We want to do that. We started to cooperate and actually work with some of the UAP enthusiast groups, these special interest groups. Some of them, SCU was one, they sent us a PhD dissertation that was superb. It's the type of analytical work and rigor that, as an intel professional, we would have used. And I think cooperation with these legitimate scientific organizations is something we need to do. I do not believe the federal government, the U.S. government, has a monopoly on UAP knowledge. I really think that we need to have a white tent. We need where we don't have this national security concern. We got to protect something. The fact that we've detected the UAP is not classified unless it's in a restricted area, or we detected it with some type of sensor that we don't want to share its characteristics with. We want to protect methods and sources. But the fact in our own classification guide, we found aliens is not something we would have classified. Now, the public disclosure would have been a decision by, the DOD, the Undersecretary for Public Affairs in the White House, not us. But the fact that we detected something we don't understand wasn't necessarily a classified event. And we did our best, trying to collect data, primary data, unclassified data. There was a lot of SAP-CAP data that we had to protect due to the sensor and the location where that data was collected. And we had the means to store and manipulate and then aggregate classified and unclassified and public information, where that aggregated data could be very, very sensitive and very useful to our adversaries. But we were able to protect it, and we are protecting it. I was just always amazed how this quickly became a big data challenge. If you look at the decades of information that we've collected, we've been staring at the stars for a long time. We have a lot of critical infrastructure in space that we want to protect. We actually have a document with the space community where we have defined a UAP in space and what AARO's role is. We also realize, due to the huge masses of data, that it's beyond humans, our analysts, to be able to exploit. And we got to do that with, algorithms, machine processing, computers, to be able to do it at mission speed. So it's useful, so we can send track data to somebody responsible for the security in that domain. And AARO's working very, very quickly to get there. One of the things that Congress, in their wisdom, did in last year's NDAA, they actually have a mandatory disclosure. So all the government's UAP information, that data has to be transferred to the National Archivist. So the classified data that DOD has, the DODIC tasked AARO. So AARO went out and we've hired, I think it was 8 to 10, I think we're almost up to 10 now, analysts that do nothing but security reviews to see if we can't declassify this UFO UAP reporting so it can be passed to the national NARA. So NARA goes back to NARA so they can publish it, and so it can be discoverable and be shared with the American people. And I think there's some real value in those archive and that data to go back and start looking at patterns of life. What's in the data? How often can we correlate the detection of UAPs or UFO in the vicinity of nuclear weapons infrastructure? There's been books written on it. Is it real? One of the things we had a difficult time with is what is the baseline of UAP activity? We kind of understood what it was around critical for infrastructure, but what was the norm in places that we weren't trying to protect? And AARO's working now trying to understand that and actually working, has some contract vehicles and some grants where we're working with academia to say, help us understand this, because this is historical data. We can go back and start looking for trends. And maybe that will help us in our understanding and guide us in the placement of our sensors. So we haven't talked about the Gremlin, but the Gremlin was a system, a family of sensors, both active and passive, active radar, hyperspectral sensors from audio to RF energy that we could integrate and we could produce a common operational picture. So we would have a detection and then we could slew the other sensors to try to understand that track or that thing that was identified. And then there would be some processing that help us correlate the characteristics of that track with something known. And when the behavior, the flight characteristics of that track didn't confirm, didn't align with something we knew, now you got a real UAP, and what is it? And then we start throwing more stuff out and get more expensive sensors, trying to understand that, because the world's just too dangerous of a place to have something operate in our proximity that we don't understand. There was a couple of brothers, the Testester brothers, I think there were some scientists that put a bunch of sensors on an RV out on Long Island Sound, and they wrote a book about it.
Yeah, there was that group, and then there's also the sensors on top of Harvard, Avi Loeb's Galileo project.
Oh, yeah, that was Dr. Loeb who came in and visited with us, but we were fascinated by that. The idea of having a mobile, deployable Gremlin actually came from that. We thought that was brilliant. If we could get our sensors, our prime power, and our storage, our computing on one platform, so we didn't have, a commercial driver's license. We had a contract to get it hauled out somewhere and position these trailers around the country so we could close at a UAP incident and maybe, get some collection why the incident was still ongoing. And we had some success for that, where AARO actually had like a rapid reaction capability where we had some handheld equipment. We had trained military and some scientists who are willing to deploy into the field, and sometimes, some harsh conditions. But we were able, especially at sensitive sites, we get a call, we would dispatch them using commercial conveyance, commercial flights, rent cars, get out there quickly and work with the reporting organization that detected that, anomaly or that incident, and stay out there and help bring in other sensors so we could capture it in real time. And at the same time, debrief the observers, get witness statements and start searching for and curating all the evidence. So that data preservation was absolutely essential. And we learned that when we were supporting the UAS incidents down at Langley Air Base down there in Virginia in Hampton Roads. That was one of the challenges we had when we got asked to come in there and help reconstruct some of the radar plots, the radar tracks of where these UASs originated from and where they were recovered and what they were trying to survey. So law enforcement would know where, to start their search for who was operating these drones in restricted airspace. As we went back and started collecting data, we found out often the DoD systems the next night rewrote over their data. So we had a very, very hard time trying to reconstruct data so we could understand the incidents that happened down there at Langley. We learned a lot about it on that data preservation. We also found out that the FBI and their field office was very cooperative if there were claims of evidence, forensic evidence at an incident site where they helped us in the sanitation, actually processing the site. They would treat it like a crime site, follow the Department of Justice rules for the collection of evidence, that curation process, where they actually helped us at a couple of UAP incidents where they were in the field doing their forensic, examination of a UAP site. We realized often, especially was in a federal location, if there was a UAP incident and we wanted to bring in the Department of Justice, the violation would be trespassing.
Yeah, well, of course. Let me ask you this now regarding Gremlin. Is this still active, and can we deploy Gremlin or make mini Gremlins to sort of get a lot of coverage of areas that seem to have elevated levels of UAP incidences? Can we make more Gremlins and get a gigantic data set from that the public can look through? If Kozlowski's looking to do citizen science and involve the public to look at this stuff, well, we all love that. Look at the UFO footage. That's
Sure.
a huge thing.
We worked with a base commander and we deployed a Gremlin that's been out there for almost a year now, or it'll be a year this fall, doing a long-term collection, trying to develop a pattern of life analysis of a base out in the West that had a combination of both UAP reporting and UAS threats, drones, trespassing incidents. So we deployed our kit out there, and it's been operating. It was designed to work remotely, where we could slew the cameras and the radars, and we stored all that. But yes, we've been doing that, and there's a number of Gremlins. And this is a prototype system, a collection system using IC and DoD sensors. There's nothing new that we invented. Really, the only new thing was the integration software to build that common operational pictures and the translators from the various sensors so we could display and integrate that data on one radar screen or one screen. One of the challenges that we found out for the slow altitude air defense mission or the counter UAS mission and the UAP mission, what was the common data standard? And we found out there wasn't one in the Department of Defense. And that's really hard for our defense industrial complex to react to when there's not a standard for this data transmission. And I know that Northcom is really taking the lead on that here in the defense of the homeland. And a lot of work has been done. We were working with the PEO for counter UAS. We're involved in a lot of the incidents. We've actually, during some of our TDYs and engagement with our NATO allies, they came in and briefed us on some of the drone cases they had. We did not get involved in what happened up in New Jersey. We did look at some of the images that were claimed to be, UAPs. In every case, I think we looked at it, was actually a tier one or a group one or group two UAS that was being lawfully operated in compliance with FAA regulations, or we saw a bunch of commercial airliners with their lights on that people misidentified. But we did not find anything unusual, but we weren't working the case. This is just people had asked us, hey, could you take a look at this? You think, did we get it right? And our scientists helped out a lot, but we were not tasked to work that case. But I knew in the next Defense Authorization Act, AARO was going to be a must-coordinated office when it came to the development of counter-UAS systems and technology. So AARO has a role, and it goes back to preventing that, that technological and operational surprise. We're looking for UAPs. They have port defense systems to protect against UASs. They may detect a UAP, or we may detect a UAS, and we need to be able to exchange tracks. And that work is being done. And we work very, very closely with Northcom and the various executive program offices around the Department of Defense. I do want to make a shout out to DHS and the Air and Maritime Operations Center. they're the ones defending our borders against a lot of the airborne threats or maritime threats. And they have a superb suite of sensors out there. And working through the Air and Maritime Operations Center, they were sharing a lot of their track data, a lot of their incidents with us in near real time. And we would work with them. So a lot of the sensors we need to detect and understand are already in place. NOAA has the new enhanced digital weather radars out there, the next generation, weather radar that can detect, dust particles clouding over an icing. You have that data. We worked with MIT. They had developed a mechanism where they could take that data. We could give them the parameters, the performance, the UAP things that we were interested in, and they could siphon off that data and transmit it to us so we could get it near real time. You know that we do defend things we put up on space. We have various DoD and commercial capabilities, Department of Commerce. NASA's involved up there doing deconfliction and data, control. We work with international organizations. So there's a lot of surveillance in space. We're looking at uncorrelated tracks that now their orbits degrade and they enter the atmosphere. Well, first thing we want to do is that a re-entering warhead? Is that a threat? If it's not a threat, it could be a piece of space debris, or it could be something else that's not understood. In the past, that data, there was no organization that was motivated, had the means to actually explain and understand that. When I left, AARO is in the middle of working with Spacecom and the Space Force, actually to have like a little war game to play out how would we, at mission speeds, be able to be involved in identification of things deorbiting and coming into the atmosphere that were not deemed a threat. These are UAPs we don't quite understand. Pass that to AARO so AARO can do some analysis. And then at mission speeds, go back, update the space vaults and the various databases so we can start to have an understanding of what's going on up there. And I thought that we wanted to truly serve as the all-domain anomaly resolution office from space to the bottom of the ocean. The maritime environment was quite complex. The community, for the most part, was worried about the sound of steel moving through water. That was their primary concern. They were probably more compartmentalized than the space folks were. We did help them. We did go out in the field with some of our people working in that domain. But to tell you the truth, where we were the weakest, we had the least capability, was in the maritime domain. And that was probably our third priority. We understand.
Follow-up question there. I hate to interrupt, but
Sure.
All right, can you make maritime gremlins and deploy them on the U.S. attack submarine fleet to clarify anomalies that they see, which, as I understand them, show a signature of metal moving through water, which sounds like a torpedo. But once they determine that it's not a torpedo, it's not a Russian sub, it's not a Chinese sub, they just move on. They're like, we don't know what that is.
And we don't care. It's a shrimp mating. We spent some time up at ONI talking to the community. We're probably not going to invest in using introducing a new data to that environment, as you know how first of all, how large it is and how little is understood about, our maritime environment. But there's a lot of existing data that's not fully exploited. And I think that's where AARO's role is.
So essentially, you're going to look at the data, but not apply the same filters that they did.
Correct.
In other words, once they eliminated their threats, they're like, this isn't going to hit us, and it's not, this isn't Russian or Chinese. You're going to then go and say, well, what is the data set from the submarine that what is the raw data, and what can we try to figure out based on what they saw on their sonar return, right?
Well, there is the great satellite, a parking lot out there in the southern Indian Ocean where we deorbit things because it's the farthest from, inhabited land.
Right.
where, the population could be endangered. But we kind of understand the acoustics, the signature of something coming into the ocean. We also really understand things coming out of the ocean like a rocket. We understand that. And as you know,
Of course, that's a nuclear ballistic missile coming out of.
absolutely, absolutely. And there is a lot of data out there. And we think there's room where we can filter what we need, where we've got this new signature that's not understood. It's not a biologic, it's not some animal. What is it? And can we correlate that sound with a track that we were able to establish? Something that we detected. We have a track, we know, it deorbited here or went in the ocean here, or it came down there. It could be space debris. And we do a pretty good job trying to follow that stuff, but we don't do as much in the maritime environment. And as I said, it's kind of it was the third priority, and we needed to do what was most immediate, was airspace. And there is a true bias to the national security community is kind of what we went for first. Space, there's tons of existing data that hasn't been exploited that could provide some understanding. We also know that it's going to take some advanced computing to do that, but we have some amazing partners working with CIA and some of their contract vehicles with AWS, which was Amazon Web Services. They have some amazing capabilities where we can work at the unclassified all the way up to the TSSCI level and move data up, not necessarily down, but move it up so we can aggregate data to get better understanding. We can do that. And they were working hard. It was very, very challenging with our scientists and our contractors and university partners, where we were collecting petabytes, just so much data from our gremlin. It wasn't economic to move it back by cell. These were in a location we didn't have access to high-speed fiber. We did have Starlink, but minimal throughput for the amount of data environmental data that we were collecting. So we were putting it on data bricks and we were flying it back around, and we double encrypt it, and we were only we didn't want to store blue sky. We wanted to capture real events. But just the massive amount, we learned so much about trying to get it from a drive into the cloud without corrupting it, and then manipulate just due to the size of these files. I'm sure now, I've been out of the government for a few months now, I'm sure it's been mastered. And I think there's a treasure of information. I know that the current director wanted to do some of these science challenge, with academic partners and go out there to the public. And I know that there's a lot of source data that we could share. And, there's people out there with analytic techniques and solutions that are not imagined by the government that I think could help us understand this phenomenon. Look, the reason AARO exists is we have failed over 70 years to truly understand it. And AARO is the first organization in law funded by Congress with the support of leadership, with access to sensitive materials, with the legal authorities they need, with the funds to be able to react quickly, to get to a site, to understand what happened. We've never had that before. And it's not buried in a single service. It actually works for the principal director or deputy director of national intelligence and the deputy secretary of defense. You don't get much higher than that in the government to be a direct report to.
Now, my interest here is that when we had the massive, tragic disaster of the loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia, this happened over Texas, and south. And the one thing NASA said is don't go near the materials. And the reason is that thing had hydrazine tanks on it. And hydrazine, if it survives, that is very, very toxic. And that's why we use the satellite graveyard. Does AARO have the capability and the intent to try to track, as NORAD once did, when with tracking space trash, to track potentially dangerous satellites that are entering over U.S. territory that somebody could end up interacting with? In other words, a big old circular tank falls, and it's full of hydrazine that or residues that survived reentry, and can AARO go and then warn the public, look, don't go near that thing. Let us recover it.
It won't be AARO that does that. If it happens in North America, it's going to be Northcom. If it happens with our mission partners overseas, it's going to be that geographic, combatant commander. It's going to do that. But that plan I talked about, that I was asked by a staff director, where's DoD's plan for contact with the aliens? As you know, DoD does have contingency plans to recover sensor technologies, and responding to satellite debris that was to fall in the populated area is one of the missions that AARO has. And we have, not AARO, excuse me, the Department of Defense has. Now, we're going to assume that that material is coming from a state actor. Okay, because we're going to kind of understand the pedigree of whatever that device was, where it came from, what its orbit was, its characteristics. And we kind of, supply chain, we kind of understand that. But if we were to get the site, there was something, a piece of space debris that landed, and now it's an anomaly. It's actually, we don't know what it is. AARO and its contractors and its partners does have a role to understand what it is. And if it, and the preservation of life in the environment, and to protect the public from a potentially a hazardous incident, we would work with our DoD partners and help it, in our case, we're going to want to preserve the evidence and understand what it is, and they're going to want to protect the public and provide that logistic command and control at that incident site. So yes, and there's plans to do this, and this is all DoD support to domestic authorities. Because the chances are it's not going to land on federal property. It's probably going to be in some governor's backyard somewhere.
But there is an elephant in the room here. And I have to call you on this because I'll bet somebody in the government thought about this. There is no greater security threat than coming across an alien civilization that is 1 million years more advanced than you are in technology. It is basically a god at that point. And if you come in contact with it, there is absolutely nothing you could do to counter it. Maybe you could come up with something eventually, but it would be the doomsday scenario from hell. This is beyond anything nuclear or anything like that. You do not want to come across an alien in your atmosphere with you.
Correct.
Has that been thought about, and why would you not classify?
It has been.
Why wouldn't you classify that if it's not doing anything to actually attack you, to where you couldn't classify it? If it's just sitting there watching you, why wouldn't you keep that secret? Because that would lead people. That would cause suicides. It would cause people to become depressed. It would just create social questions and problems that would reverberate throughout every aspect of society and probably reorder geopolitics. I don't think, Ronald Reagan once asked Gorbachev, if we got attacked by aliens, would you help us? And he's like, you bet on it. Surely someone has said this to you in government, and you may have thought to yourself, yeah, we might try to really classify that, but the president has to make the decision. And what if he already has? What if it was Eisenhower?
We did a superb job of controlling, access to that incident, because we couldn't find evidence of that. There is plans, to deal with, either based off a perspective, the best case or worst case. And I think that's going to be all a government response. I really don't think the Department of Defense has the necessary expertise to make contact with an alien being. I think we do have a role, provide command and control, logistics, and security, understanding and advising the national command authorities on how to deal with it or communicate with it is a delicate task, and it goes well beyond AARO.
Black triangles are a common, yes, a
Yes.
common thing that is reported in the UFO community. And the fact is that the government did not do itself a favor. In the early days of this group of whistleblowers, they said they'd rather not talk about the shapes of them, which I know why, because you're trying to identify adversary technology that's of human origin. But people talk about things like the TR-3B, which is a fabled triangular aircraft that may look like this. And we all know about the F-117, good old Have Blue, as I mentioned earlier. And the idea of stealth blimps, it would be very useful to fly a blimp and linger over a battlefield silently, but it's still just a blimp ultimately, even if it incorporates stealth technology. Did you find evidence that we have those things? Is the TR-3B real, or is that sort of the opposite of misidentifying technology?
The flying triangles or the flying wings seems to be an optimal shape to minimize your radar cross section. There were a lot of experimentation in fielded systems based off the concept of flying wings. Look at the B-2. Some of the cases that we got from very, very credible witnesses were reports of triangular flying objects with pretty amazing performance characteristics at very sensitive places that alarmed us. And we went public with that. John was the first one to go out and admit to Congress in public that AARO had detected things we couldn't understand. And we were working very hard, to develop the technologies to be able to develop, to capture this and understand what this phenomenon was. I think that the concept of flying triangles is a technological readiness capability, like a TR level. It's fielded. We've got flying triangles out there, especially if you start looking at the UAS world. There's a lot of things out there that resemble that. And I remember when I was a Marine out in the desert, in the 1st Marine Division, we stumbled across the 117s before it was a public system. We didn't know what it was. We saw this unusual black flying aircraft out there. We do know that in the British version, the Ministry of Defense, they got tasked by their government to do the equivalent of a historical report decades before we did. And their assessment was that a lot of the UFO reporting that was going on in the UK was actually their citizens detecting U.S. stealth aircraft that was operating in airspace.
Well, there was also they also actually had a report where they were suspecting temperature inversions as creating this sort of thing. But at the same
they're
time,
not invisible.
They're not. Yeah. Well, it's something that has to, ball lightning and all that stuff all has to be considered here. But the thing is that you also had the French with Gaipan, and then you had the Russians, and they said, no, it's probably aliens. Do you know were you able to uncover why they concluded that, those two governments?
No, I know that we did, we were curious, especially when we had access to some of the old Soviet reporting. They had cases where they're actually shooting at things. I don't think that's probably a best practice, but, they shot first and then they, I guess they would recover debris to figure out what it was. No, we didn't, the fact that someone saw a flying triangle, that's within the capabilities of our engineers today. Okay. What I thought was probably more interesting is maybe the use of like a force field or plasma to provide some type of minimum radar cross section or stealth. And I thought in some of the cases we have that maybe that could account for the characteristics and the unusual, descriptions given by witnesses. They're seeing these fiery orbs. It's moving. It looks like it's some type of plasma or some type of electrical charge. around the object. And, to me, I thought, that was one of the schools of thought to help provide stealth, especially in the RF realm, is, maybe instead of having an aerofol that would defect or minimize RF energy, maybe I have a way that does the same thing, but it uses some type of ball of plasma to achieve that effect. And maybe there's been an adversary that's had some type of breakthrough with energy management that can do that. I know that AARO experimented a bit. We actually work with the Air Force labs, research labs, to say, could you use plasma to have unconventional airfolds or unconventional control surfaces? And it's proven we can do that. We do it in space now. Can you do it in the atmosphere? Yeah, you can. It has limitations, but you can do that. We looked at some of the reports of these flying balls that would often appear, these spheres that you see come across the PTEDS data, the cameras at some of these forward operating bases in Afghanistan or in Iraq. You see these spheres go by. A lot of them were balloons. Maybe some weren't. It was kind of hard to analyze those cases because the quality of the imagery wasn't that great and didn't have active radar. You just had a camera looking at it. But we do know of commercial systems that are being fielded where, they're mylar balls, but they're lighter than air and they have ducted fans to move around. And with some of the real concerning UAP cases we had at sensitive locations, I think there are probably a lighter than air craft with a propulsion system, the ability to hover, with the ability to carry some type of productive ISR payload on some type of surveillance mission. That's me as a career intel officer as a Marine. That's what I thought they were doing. Especially we saw evidence of them trying to prevent them being detected, and when there was a threat of them being surveilled, actually, reports of the vehicles moving off the roads and turning off its lights. And it's not on the road; it's actually above the road, hovering and going off into the desert until the truck goes by, and then it gets back on its merry way and completes its mission. The technology to do that, I think, it exists. Whoever would operate a system like that in restricted airspace, boy, the gall of doing that. They really, really wanted to understand or, get sensors on something to be able to take an operational risk to operate a vehicle like that in such protected space, or they thought that their stealth was good enough that they wouldn't be detected. I think we're also going to move into a new domain where we're going to see more optical stealth. We know now that there's shields out there that would actually bend photons around and kind of mimic the background that's around you, almost like an octopus or a squid. If you could have some type of active device, like a cloaking device, that could go on the skin of an aircraft, that would expend, a lot of these stealth aircraft primarily operate at night because they're not invisible. But if you could have some type of active optical stealth, maybe we can expand the operating hours, utility of some of these capabilities. And there may be some technological breakthroughs that we have new technologies that have been fielded that we're not fully aware of. I think we're working hard to understand that and be able to detect these things. But that's part of the preventing an operational and technological surprise. There are new technologies. There's a new emerging techniques and capabilities that could be very disruptive. We've got this whole world in DoD of counters and countermeasures.
Yeah, one just has to see what happened in New Jersey with the sightings of the drones. You can really make, I mean, have you seen those displays where they take 1,000 drones and they do a light display?
Yes.
Almost like a fireworks display,
Yes.
and things like that. Well, you can do that without the lights on and really confuse some people, right? And I think that we're in a precarious period of time where that not everybody is familiar with this technology. It's like back in the 90s with the Chinese lanterns. Not everybody was familiar that you could put a light in the sky that's just, and we're in a very, very confusing period because of rapidly evolving technology. But I have one final question for you.
Great.
And that question is this. Within the UFO community, there is a lot of interesting information, correct or not, about contractors, and that the Nixon administration transferred the whole UFO question to the contractor system to hide it under the Nuclear Secrecy Act. Did you find any evidence of this, and how was it approaching contractors and asking them, do you have these materials, because of things like the fabled Wilson Davis memo, and that what if there's any validity to that? But I know that you had Admiral Wilson in a skiff, so explain all that, please.
I had a Q clearance. I used to work nuclear weapons counterproliferation. I'm familiar with that world. Understand the Wilson memo and the claims there actually was part of I was in on an interview with that. A lot of those claims that were made were untrue. If you talk to the principals, and I think a lot of this we captured in our report, people exaggerated what happened and what was said or the access they claimed they had. I will tell you that we had great cooperation from leadership, especially in the aerospace industry. Had some great partners that we worked with. They opened everything up they could. If there was a SAP or CAP or a covert action that we needed to get read into, we did get read into it. Now, we're talking about incidents that occurred 40, 50 years ago. In that case, do we have access to all the historical evidence or everything that did happen? It's hard to prove a negative. We don't know. The current management executives today thought that they had done a thorough research. They understood what happened in the past. They reported to us there was no proof of this. But here again, and we're a government organization, researching and doing almost an IG function on the IG with the UAP phase. And there's a lot of people who just don't trust their government. Private sector, we have to, they're patriotic, loyal Americans. They wanted to get to the truth as well. There were a lot of people buying in that were disparaged, and there were claims that they were part of this hidden UFO recovery and reverse engineering exploitation programs. I will tell you that some people who came in and testified to their knowledge of these programs, there was genuine fear, there was concern that they would be held accountable, to nefarious people in the government that don't want the truth to come out. No one ever produced an NDA that they could give us that proved that someone had threatened them with their life. There was the statutory requirement or the statutory penalty under Title 18 for espionage, that the death penalty is part of that. It could be part of that. It'd be held subject to that if you were convicted. But we never saw any NDA in writing that somebody was threatened. I do know individuals that we attempted to come in for interviews were frightened. They had legitimate fears that the government would harm them if they revealed what they knew about these programs. We did our best trying to convince them it was safe to talk to AARO. We made a lot of reasonable accommodations as far as travel and going places where they felt safe, where we could interview them. We had professional law enforcement and intelligence debriefers, law enforcement investigators conduct these interviews. We had strategic debriefers, DOD, DIA clandestine trained officers, case officers that we work with to work with interviews, trying to develop additional leads. We would get an incident or a story or a claim, and we would go wherever wherever we had to go to try to understand the truth. And I can honestly tell you that no one shut doors in our faces or did not cooperate. Not not during the time that I was there. And, talking with Sean, I can't think of any case that he shared with me where we had a commercial entity or a member of the government or former military member that did not, want to cooperate. These are patriots. They were part of our national security apparatus or, community of interest. They had incredible technologists and scientists who helped develop a lot of the weapon systems and such as we have today. These are patriots, and they freely shared with us what they knew. And we all came to a conclusion that due to the secrecy and the processes that the government maintained that compartmentalize information to very sensitive materials, the fact that your government does do recovery operations, we do pick up incredible technology, but all of those missions and capabilities, we recovered and we exploited technologies and capabilities invented and developed by human beings. We didn't find anything that we thought had some type of supernatural or we thought came from another planet other than ours. And we tried, we looked, there were double-blind tests with the scientific community when we had materials that they did analyze. It all came back, said that it was invented here. And, the materials came from this planet. I wish, there was something more exciting I could share, but we just didn't find it. I say there was great cooperation, and there was an expectation from, the executive branch people we reported to and our congressional oversight. They want us to run down every lead and consider every possibility that there could be some supernatural basis to some of the claims made by people have made about, UFOs or UAPs. We could find no evidence to support those claims. And we searched, we looked, we weren't afraid to find it. Many of, our staff were eager to find it, but we didn't. Now, we found other national security concerns. Often some of them.
Yeah, but we don't want to know. We don't want to know about those. That's national security stuff. And if it's something that China and Russia is doing, yeah.
Right. In serialized intelligence reporting, and Congress is well aware of our involvement with those cases.
Now, last order of business. Explain Yankee Blue.
We found a SAP program where it was an Air Force initiative. It started out as a training tool to be able to train new staff and new administrators in the special access management offices. So if you got an Air Force installation and they're working with special access materials or programs, you have to be read into those programs so you can understand how to protect those programs, how to communicate aspects of those programs, what can be communicated on different mediums. So there's a whole bureaucratic process on how that's done. Well, Yankee Blue was originally created as a training aid to teach these administrators how to brief and debrief people on these programs. These administrators, they have to be read into thousands of SAPs and CAPs. They don't work them. They just know they exist. They read people out and they read them in and read them out. At some point, according to the Air Force IG that investigated this and shared their findings with us after we discovered it, is this went into the wild, and then was this SAP, Yankee Blue, was had it's all correct as far as the format, the trigraph, everything about it. If you looked at it, you would have thought it was a legitimate program. It looked like all the other programs out there. It went into the wild, and for decades, Air Force administrators who worked in the SAPCOs, military and civil servants, bred people into programs believing that we had some type of anti-gravity motor or anti-gravity capability. On that slide, nowhere did it say anything about aliens, but the graphic, the image in the middle of that brief is the classic 1950s, 1960 UFO, levitating with a bunch of white-coated scientists around it pulling modules out of it. That, it was really well done. Well, according to the Air Force IG, this got out in the wild and was being misused. So they were basically hazing personnel assigned to the SAPCOs throughout the Air Force for decades. We also found evidence that this same Yankee Blue theme or idea got out of the Air Force and was being used by one other service.
Really?
When we found, yes, it was very popular, very successful. And we were trying to understand how many people were read into this program and read out without knowing it wasn't real. It didn't exist. And when I thought I was alarmed enough about this that, we went up and we briefed. Sean was gone, and I had to brief the director of national intelligence and say, this is our finding. She asked me a really good question. And she said, Tim, have you done a damage assessment? And I said, ma'am, and we've requested it. But she said, how many people think this is a real, and could this be the basis for this persistent, urban myth that the United States government for decades has been recovering and reverse engineering alien technology? How many people were read into this program and read out without knowing it was false? They were just being screwed with. It was hazing. And we did not know, but we assessed probably thousands. If you think of all the Air Force installations and all the SAPCOs over a period of 20 years, a typical serviceman or woman is probably assigned somewhere for 2 years before they move on. There are thousands of people that were read into this program, signed a lifelong non-disclosure agreement that they can't discuss it. So is that the reason that so many Americans, highly trained professionals with security clearances, think their government, has been recovering and exploiting alien technologies for decades?
That's problematic and spooky in its own right, that such a thing would happen, because we live with the government that MK Ultra and the things and they did destroy documents during that. Tim, we are out of time, and I thank you for your candor in the matter. And I very much thank you for your service as a U.S. Marine and me as a U.S. citizen. That's no secret. And I hope that, well, number one, I hope you do well in your endeavors from here on. And I hope that AARO continues on to come up with at least interesting information to somebody that's worth knowing, especially nation state threats. And if they discover aliens, that's going to be
absolutely
very scary. If they do, it's going to be terrifying, because you don't want them here.
Yeah, if they can figure out that time-space challenge and move across, God's creation and show up here, a living being, they have technology we can only imagine.
Yeah.
Most of our scientists thought if there was contact, it would probably be some type of reconnaissance, some type of robot, the same way, we develop our Voyager, satellites and actually exert, our solar system. That's what they thought, just because you have that, we used to call the tyranny of distance when I was in Indo-PACOM. We're talking 10,000 miles. The distance, you think the universe is 14 billion years old? There could have been incredible civilizations that rose and were consumed by their black hole or their sun that no longer exist at some time. And we just, we missed each other. I don't know if there's other advanced civilizations out there. I have no idea. I'm a grunt and an intel guy. I don't know anything about alien beings.
Well, you don't know. All you know, all the information you have is that it statistically seems likely, with the amount of star systems out there, that there is someone else. But if that someone else can cross that distance, and there are things within general relativity and theories that say that, look, we worry about crossing space and going to Alpha Centauri because it's going to kill off your entire lifetime as a human, your 70 years.
Correct.
But if you live for 2 million years and you've conquered, aging, and you've conquered that concern, it's not that much. Or you could send a von Neumann probe out. But what worries me is that if there is a von Neumann probe sitting in the solar system printing out UFOs, atmospheric probes to look into human civilization, and worse, it crashes them, because that's what we do. We're the only species we can prove that actually crashed saucers on another world, and it was Mars, and it was the back shells of the Mars rovers. Yeah, we discard stuff. Maybe something like that would too. Is that considered within RO? I hate to ask that question because we already just finished the interview, but just hit me.
I'll tell you, if there were evidence of that, we would have loved to find it. We didn't, and we searched for it. But we know more about the our own solar system than we know about our oceans. There could be things out there that we haven't explored yet. I hope somebody does find something, extraordinary and supernatural. It could exist. We just don't have any evidence for it. And that's why I hope that they continue to fund AARO and support them and let them continue their mission. I hope we can be more transparent, do more with the public, do more, with academic centers of excellence out there. There's a lot of bright people that could help us understand more about this phenomena. And then where we do have a national security concern, help us build, the sensors, the counters, so we can protect, this country that I love. The world is a dangerous place, and it's foolish not to understand phenomena that we can detect, in close proximity, to our critical infrastructure and operating forces. It's just, to me, it's common sense. And I would say that our elected leaders get that.
Makes sense. I'm glad somebody's looking into it. Yeah, I'm glad somebody's looking into it, because that, in hindsight with AARO, it looks like there was a hole there, that needed to be filled as far as intelligence gathering. And now we have it.
Yes, absolutely. And if AARO does find something and they don't share it with the public, there probably is a legitimate national security concern. It probably has something to do with the development of a foreign capability.
If it's a foreign capability, that we don't want to know about that. We just want to know if it's aliens.
Correct.
But if it's a foreign capability, do your best to counter it, and we don't need to know. We'll hear about it in 30 years.
Exactly. With our culture, we can't keep secrets.
That's true.
And can you imagine if there actually was this black program dealing with the recovery of aliens, that it's gone through multiple generations now? There wouldn't have been a deathbed confession.
There actually have been a couple of those. There was,
with some evidence to support the claims.
Yeah,
okay,
there wasn't. That was my, I'm open-minded, and I believe in just saying, okay, well, we have these people that claim to see, objects of unknown origin, and sure, they do. People see UFOs. They are objects they can't identify, and people have a lore around it. And I look at that and keep an open mind, and I say, what's rational? And then you also have a cottage industry around it, where you have people that make claims because they know that gets viewed.
People have monetized it. But there's been some progress. You can now be a person with security clearance or fly $70 million airplanes for the government. You can see something and report it as a UAP, and you don't lose your security clearance. Matter of fact, you're encouraged to report these things. That is progress.
Well,
And
that's
I
what
loved, I worked
Moultrie
with,
and Bray said in their congressional testimony. They're like, we need to destigmatize, and that is important. Destigmatize, let people
exactly.
talk about it. It's just UFOs. This isn't anything that, everybody talk about it and do it
We
openly
need to understand
and
it.
understand it. And maybe we'll find something
Yeah.
weird. What would be fun is if it's even weirder than aliens. Some of those concepts, like the prior technological civilizations originating from Earth and things like that. So there's cool ideas that we can at least do thought experiments about.
And there are some amazing capability and willing partners that actually want to work with us. And I think the US government needs to share, unclassified, non-sensitive data with them and say, what do you think? Can you help us understand this?
Citizen science. Yeah, and if
And if we
Kozlowski can
can
do
do
that,
that, I think we're going to get more trust.
well, if you can do that, if he can do that, Kozlowski can get a citizen science project looking at footage from the government and saying, "Hey guys, what do you think this is?" I mean, that's going to be absolutely engaging for the public because, well, let's face it, we paid for it.
Well, exactly. And we're also working with, state, local, tribal law enforcement to help streamline the reporting. We've invested in state fusion centers, kind of enhance command and control and operational response at the state level. You've got all these, first responders out there. We were actually working and actually partnered with some people in the community to kind of put together best practices for UAP investigative response. What questions do you have? How do you archive? What data is available so we can understand more and share more. AARO has a lot of things a lot of initiatives they were trying to do. And we have the transition to the new government and hopefully, working with the new political appointees, they're going to make some new inroads and actually have a whole new set of eyes and ears and reporting. We have a lot of government reporting. Well, we're also going to have a public reporting mechanism where the public can report to AARO what they see. So that collection bias we have on that heat map, those are all DoD and IC sensors protecting things, where we sense where we want to protect. But now we're going to have the entire population of the United States will have the opportunity. They see something, UAP to be able to report that. And I'll bet that heat map looks a lot different.
I'll bet it does. I'll bet it
Yes.
does. And maybe you can put the gremlin out there, after you start getting these reports, deploy the gremlin and maybe get some information.
And
Now, yeah, I think that would be cool. I think an interactive approach would help to clarify.
or it's more than gremlins. How about the sensors at
Well,
Harvard?
Galileo. Yeah.
How about those scientists? Exactly. There's a lot of stuff that we have. And then, AARO actually had worked with the community to help develop algorithms to better utilize our NTM to detect things like Chinese spy balloons. If we can
What about build
detect,
your own gremlin instructions on the AARO website to collect data according to a standard with off-the-shelf
well,
parts?
I think people have actually thought about that. I would love to put some of the non-sensitive pattern of life data that the gremlins have detected and put it out there and let somebody, work on it and do a PhD dissertation. Or go to one of the DoD war colleges and say, hey, we have a case here. Here's some data. Why don't you take a look at it and publish a paper on what you think it is?
All right, Tim, let's just hope that if the public gets engaged and it turns into a citizen science project to try to correlate data regarding UAP, I hope two things. Number one, I hope that we find some weird atmospheric phenomena, meteorological phenomena that we didn't know about that are very rare, such as ball lightning and plasmas,
Right.
and get data on that and hand that to the relevant scientists. And I also hope we find aliens. Wouldn't that be fun? But may not be. May not be fun.
Yes, and have a network grid of sensors.
A network grid of sensors.
Staring at the heavens.
And then the
And
other
how
thing
we're
is
up-
that I hope that somebody in the government has the sense not to Yankee blue the public citizen science project.
Agreed. Hey, maybe this golden, dome concept the president has mentioned, it's going to take a lot of data, and a lot of sensing to pull off. And maybe there's a rich source of data to help us understand UAPs. If you talk to some of the air defense control centers and you ask them, do you have UAPs? Like in the National Capital Region, they'll come back and tell you no, because we'll keep on throwing sensors and intercept it until we understand what it is.
That's important, but you need the right sensors.
That's right. And it's a huge investment. Yeah. And I remember from reading from a dead German, to protect everything's protect nothing. So we need to be strategic, and we're going to have to invest in technologies and sensing to protect our critical infrastructure and network it so we can provide, responsive indications and warning to people who care.
And indeed the world. We've been talking as American citizens the whole time, but at the same time, this also pertains to global security. So anything that AARO finds and publishes goes to other governments, and, our global free democracies, where we have them, can use that information as well and incorporate that in what they see.
It's probably not known, but one of the things we did, that we always try to publish at RAIL 5 Eyes, releasable 5 Eyes to the Commonwealth community. So we did make that determination. We did get permission to do that. So there is some automatic dissemination with some of our closest foreign national security partners.
All right, Tim, thank you.
Thank you so much for this.
Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.